Have you ever actually stopped to wonder if your personality is just this random collection of habits you've picked up over the years, or is it actually a hardwired genetic blueprint? Like, are you talkative just because you practiced it, or were you literally born that way? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolutely fascinating work of psychologist H.J. Eysenck. He's really the primary architect behind this bold idea that who we are at our very core is deeply rooted in our biology.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is a quick look at what we're covering today. 1. The biological blueprint. 2. Neuroticism versus emotional stability. 3. Extraversion versus introversion. 4. Psychoticism versus sociability. And finally, 5. Measuring your personality. All right, Section 1, the biological blueprint.
So I want you to imagine human psychology like this massive, complex control board. In Eysenck's view, all those endless complexities of human personality can actually be boiled down to just a few broad dimensions. Think of them as giant sliders on this board. But here's the real kicker, the source of these dimensions. They aren't just learned behaviors shaped entirely by your environment or how you were raised. Nope. According to Eysenck, these broad dimensions are fundamentally, biologically, and genetically based. You essentially come into the world with a certain physiological setting that heavily dictates how you're going to react to the world around you. And each of these broad dimensions acts like a huge umbrella covering a whole bunch of really specific traits.
Which, naturally leads us to a pretty profound question. If our personality is biologically rooted, how much control do we actually have over our own feelings? Just think about the last time you got incredibly frustrated or deeply anxious. Was that a conscious choice, or was it just a biological reflex? Moving on to Section 2, Neuroticism versus emotional stability.
This first slider on our human control board measures exactly that, the degree to which people actually have control over their feelings. Eysenck called this dimension neuroticism versus emotional stability. And it's a spectrum, right? On one end, you have individuals who really struggle to keep a tight grip on their emotional responses. And on the complete opposite end, you have folks who seem completely unflappable. They maintain incredibly high control over how they feel and react. Now, what's absolutely fascinating here is the stark contrast in the words used to describe the extremes of this dimension. Let's look at the neurotic end first. People who score highly here are often anxious, moody, touchy, and restless. Eysenck pointed out that these individuals quickly lose control of their emotions when they're faced with stress. But contrast that with the other extreme, emotional stability. These are the people you definitely want around in an emergency. They're calm, even-tempered, highly reliable, and they remain firmly under control no matter what life throws at them. So looking at these two extremes, the stormy volatility versus the calm umbrella, where do you think your personal slider sets?
All right, so that dimension covers our internal emotional control. But what about our external lives? Like, what dictates our social energy and how we engage with the people and the environment around us? That brings us to Section 3, Extraversion versus Introversion. Now, this is a dimension that probably feels a bit more familiar to you. Extraversion versus introversion. This slider measures the degree to which a person is socially outgoing as opposed to socially withdrawn. But again, Eysenck is arguing that this isn't just a lifestyle preference you randomly decided on. It is a genetically based dimension of exactly who you are. Let's break down the specific behavioral traits that fall under this umbrella. On the extrovert side of the spectrum, we see individuals who are incredibly active and highly gregarious. But it actually goes way beyond just liking parties. Eysenck identified them as impulsive and thrill-seeking. This is the friend whose biology literally drives them to suggest going skydiving on a random Tuesday. Their biology essentially pushing them to seek out external stimulation. On the flip side, we have the introvert. The traits here describe someone who is much more passive, quiet, cautious, and reserved. They just don't need that high level of external thrill to feel satisfied. In fact, their biological baseline means they might actually go out of their way to avoid it. So you can really see how these traits perfectly illustrate that internal slider leaning heavily toward either thrill-seeking action or quiet caution.
For a long time, those two dimensions, emotional control and social energy, were the absolute core of Eysenck's theory, but they don't quite explain everything, do they? What about the darker, more nonconformist side of human behavior? Where does hostility or rule-breaking fit into this genetic blueprint?
Let's look at Section 4, Psychoticism versus Sociability.
Eysenck eventually added this third slider, calling it psychoticism versus sociability. Now, it's really important to clarify that this dimension does interact with the other two we just discussed, but it represents a completely different spectrum of human interaction.
We're looking at a sliding scale between hostile, nonconformist behavior on one far end and highly cooperative, sociable behavior on the other.
And wow, the traits associated with high psychoticism are intense. Eysenck described individuals scoring high on this dimension as hostile, egocentric, and antisocial. A huge defining characteristic here is a pronounced lack of feeling for others. They interact with people in a very tough manner and have this strong tendency to defy social conventions. The source material actually points out that scoring very high on this dimension is linked to psychopathology. It's essentially this biological tendency to just disregard the cooperative rules that hold society together. So we've got these three massive genetically rooted dimensions: emotional stability, extroversion, and psychoticism. But, theories are really just theories unless they can actually be tested. So how do psychologists actually measure this invisible biological blueprint out in the real world? Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Measuring Your Personality. So the crucial point here is that Eysenck didn't just sit around theorizing. He created a practical tool to measure it, known as the Eysenck's Personality Questionnaire, or the EPQ. Now, this test initially just assessed those first two dimensions we talked about: introversion, extroversion, and emotional stability, instability. It did this by carefully evaluating 32 distinct personality traits that fall under those two broad umbrellas. But as Eysenck's theory evolved, so did his questionnaire, and it was later updated to successfully include that complex third dimension of psychoticism. Even today, the EPQ remains a widely used test in psychology for studying these exact dimensions of personality. It is literally the practical key to unlocking this theoretical blueprint. By looking at the EPQ and Eysenck's three dimensions, we get this fascinating, highly structured look at human nature. But it leaves us with one final, deeply personal question to ponder. If your personality, your tendency for anxiety, your desire for thrills, or even your willingness to conform is fundamentally built on a genetic blueprint, well, how much of you can you truly change? If the sliders are set by biology, are we all just learning to live with our factory settings, or can we somehow rewrite the code? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning what makes you, you.